14 years now. I am from Massachusetts originally. Went to high school in Westwood, did my master's degree at MIT, and lived in Somerville for a little while. My dad grew up in Needham. My mom was from Haverhill. My sister lives in Needham. So while I haven't lived here in a while, about 20 years now, I sort of know New York. So the topic is what's to be done with vacant big boxes, dead malls, dying commercial strips, aging office parks, and garden apartment complexes. Can we build a better urb? We can by retrofitting suburbia. So here's an outline of the topics in my presentation. And as was mentioned, I've co-authored and authored 2 books, Retrofitting Suburbia with Ellen Dunham-Jones, who's at Georgia Tech. Perhaps some of you have met her, I don't know. And then Designing Suburban Futures from Island Press, which documents a design competition I organized for the Roush Foundation under their Long Island Index project. So it's a competition document, but it also has some other materials in it as well on the history of suburbanization and then architects and designers' roles in it. Ellen and I both have essays in Retrofitting Sprawl, which came out a couple of years ago, and I have an essay in World of Malls, which was the catalog for an exhibit at the Architecture Museum in Munich last year. So sort of American development paradigms of the suburbs are of global interest. So the prologue, North American urban landscapes are dominated by the products of late 20th century suburbanization. It's resulted in an unsustainable built environment littered with dead and sick malls, high vacancy rates in strip malls and suburban office parks, lots of ghost boxes, vacant big box stores, and acres and acres of asphalt parking lots. So what to do? My contention that we must marshal the power of good design to help shape a more resilient future for the metropolitan surrounds. And I think design is a key piece of this. There's density and there's density, and design can often make a significant difference. I might also add that part of the Build a Better Burb or Retrofitting Suburbia agenda is to prevent more short-term commercial suburban form from getting built on greenfields in the periphery in the first place. So can we redirect that energy back to already urbanized places that are suboptimal in their resilience and sustainability? So the big challenge to improve that resiliency of the suburbs is to look at the places where the vast majority of the U.S. population lives, and this is a population representing all income levels, all ages, all races, all countries of origin. So we have to move past some of the stereotypes, I think, that are associated with the suburban population. And the basic proposition, to restate, is that we've urbanized more than enough land already in our metropolitan areas, and we need to steward it more sustainably by retrofitting sprawl, and especially the obsolete commercial stuff. So I'll discuss 3 strategies and 11 tactics for doing this from an urban design perspective to get from underperforming asphalt to incremental metropolitanism. So the opportunities are in this underperforming asphalt. We have a dramatically over-retailed landscapes. And what can we do with all these surface parking lots? So this is built out, often described as built out by leaders in suburban municipalities and counties, but there is obviously still a lot of opportunity there. So what are some of the dynamics driving retrofitting? There's the opportunity to mitigate the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, because the average suburbanite has 3 times the carbon footprint of the average center city dweller. Poverty is on the rise in suburban areas, so there are now more people living in poverty in suburban areas than in center cities. public health concerns, chronic diseases associated with or correlated with sedentary lifestyles, and there's a lot of new research, some of you are probably quite familiar with this, from the public health community, recognizing that urban form and how we build our communities can lead to direct improvement and cost savings in the health area. There's, of course, demographic change. I want to highlight that, the rise or increase in 1- and 2-person households associated with longevity. We spend a longer percentage of our lives in our non-child-rearing phase. There's increased diversity in suburbs, and especially first suburbs, and I think this provides some opportunity. In the meeting earlier with developers, there was much hand-wringing about how resistant communities were in the Boston area. I think some of the communities that have experienced demographic change or turning more into ethnoburbs might be more ripe or conducive or welcoming to conversation about retrofitting and change. And then this last one I wanted to highlight, leapfrogging development patterns leading to relative centrality for some older suburban areas. And of course, we have to look at the different typologies of suburbs. Some more elite suburbs are going to be very resistant to change and can afford to be so. Others are more receptive to these conversations. And this is a diagram from the 2008-2009 Retrofitting Suburbia, a book looking at all of these sort of office park locations around the Route 128 corridor that might be receptive to retrofitting. So Ellen and I introduced the term incremental metropolitanism in our book to advocate for a polycentric vision for metropolitan areas that could be advanced by the retrofitting of appropriate sites. And we were discussing a little bit earlier here in Boston, you have very weak counties. I know you've organized into these regions, but what is the kind of polycentric future Boston? What would be the outlying centers that you would want to see densified and connected or networked to downtown Boston and Harvard Square that are already known developed centers that are already known in the metropolitan area? So the idea here is by advancing the retrofitting of appropriate sites, densifying and diversifying nodes along transit-served corridors on the one hand, and on the other hand, potentially de-densifying other sites, especially sites that could be targeted for ecological repair. So wetland sites that were filled in and perhaps never should have been, can that be rolled back in some kind of regional way? So we identified 3 main strategies or approaches, and these came out of initially dozens of case studies that we studied, and now Ellen maintains a database with 1,500 examples, I think 1,400 or 1,500 examples that we collected and categorized, mostly by the pre-redevelopment or pre-retrofitting types of all of the shopping malls, all of the office parks, all of the golf courses now is starting to be a category for retrofitting as well. So reinhabitation refers to various forms of adaptive reuse. So you already have the building, there's some embodied energy in it. If it's vacant, can it be re-inhabited with a new use? Redevelopment often refers to urbanization, so it can involve demolition and new construction to increase density, change up the use mix, introduce new uses in an environment that might be single-use, car-dependent, low density, and to introduce walkability, bikeability, transit, and so all those good things. And then regreening, which can range from the introduction, in our view, of small parks and plazas, adding to the civic realm, basically, in a suburban setting, to restoring wetlands, ecologies, and wildlife corridors at a larger, more regional scale. And these can be used alone or in combination. So I'll just go over each with a few examples. So in many cases, the best strategy is to encourage and support reinhabitation, at least in a short-term basis, of older vacant retail sites with small community-oriented businesses, like those one finds serving immigrant communities in ethnoburb suburbs along the strip. Many ghost boxes, like this dead grocery store in Texas, have been converted to more community-serving uses. In this case, it's a branch public library. So you see a new skin put on the bones of the old building, and also the parking lot has been re-inhabited and improved with drainage swales and new landscaping and so on. So there's an improvement here, although it hasn't really changed the surrounding morphology. There's also potential of food to turn a place around. So this is the strip center in Phoenix that was given a coat of bright orange paint and some new shade structures, and it's become a third place for its neighborhood. So instead of having a dry cleaner and nail salon and not so popular businesses, it's a real community gathering place. So from strip to hip in its neighborhood. Then there have been dozens of retrofits of malls and big boxes for meds and eds uses. So on the upper right, the upper level of the 100 Oaks Mall in Nashville was taken over by the community health services of Vanderbilt University. So the inline stores have become medical suites for each of the specialties for outpatient visits and so on, and they use the food court, so you can get a snack or a coffee before and after your medical appointment. They have the parking lot, and then the lower level of the mall, the two-story mall, all of the remaining tenants, retail tenants, were consolidated on the ground floor. So it kind of combines those things in a way that makes sense. And then these other examples are wellness centers that are places for young people to exercise, or for the older population. It's often tied to preventative health programs. And these are distributed, there's a whole chain of them that have been built in New Jersey, and southern New Jersey, and eastern Pennsylvania that are in vacated big box stores. Then the second strategy, redevelopment, refers to a more systemic transformation. Again, this is my urban design perspective. A more systemic transformation of these large, prototypical, single-use, campus-like car-dependent sites that have failed. So here there's an opportunity to change the underlying urban morphological structure. So it's not so much about new uses as really changing that morphology. This is the smallest scale example in iconic Levittown on Long Island, where you have a monoculture of detached houses. And this was a little commercial strip that was redeveloped into subsidized townhouses for seniors. So this is a place for folks who are already living in the community to downsize out of their detached house and find a different housing choice within their existing community. This is an example of a big box store that was demolished and the site was redeveloped for a community center. This is in Arlington, Virginia, and the neighborhood here has 40% foreign-born, 2/3 non-white. This is a diversified neighborhood, and the gym serves kids and teens and also the older population. And then there's 122 affordable housing units in the back building, 12 of them barrier-free, so it's serving seniors and disabled. It's a very attractive building right up on the sidewalk. And this is part of the corridor, the Columbia Pike corridor in Arlington, that has a form-based code overlay that's been implemented in 2 phases. So the project I just showed you is in, can you see it? Oh, it's just a big picture. In this node there, and then these images on the bottom are this other node where you can see sort of one-story auto-oriented car showrooms and things being gradually replaced with multi-level housing buildings, and the whole street has been remade. So instead of this median, that dimension has been transferred into widened sidewalks on each side with the green strips and benches and so on. So it's a sort of a public and private working together. And then this is redevelopment of a regional shopping mall. This is one of the primary case study examples in retrofitting Suburbia. This is Belmar in Lakewood, outside of Denver. So you had a regional shopping mall and a 106-acre campus-type parcel, and it was a public-private partnership. So the municipality, working with Continuum Partners, a developer out of downtown Denver, and Elkis Manfredi of Boston, who are the urban designers, to sort of restructure this into 22 urban walkable mixed-use blocks. And the land of the new streets was deeded into public ownership. So those are public streets, so they're going to have resiliency over time, and you have the opportunity to differentiate each block. So it's not a matter of the whole mall fails and it's like dominoes falling down or collapsing, that any particular piece of this going forward, an individual building could get redeveloped, new uses could get put in, something that was conceived of as retail might turn into some other use over time. So that's an idea about resiliency, to make what had been a kind of one development that's really the size of an urban downtown, and to truly think about it that way and steward it going forward. So I think that's pretty significant. And what they did here too in laying out the new streets was a design piece, was to line up the streets with the grid of the adjacent subdivision, so that it's not a kind of enclave that only refers back to itself, but it connects up and across the arterial. So these are some examples, but it's hybrid, because you're still developing at this time, 10 years ago, at the suburban price points and wanting to have kind of suburban type development themes. So you have multiplex cinema, but it's embedded in the block. Or here, this is one of the anchor stores from the shopping mall. It had been built later than the rest of the mall, and it was deemed salvageable. So that building was kept and wrapped with a liner of office over retail and embedded into the new morphology, the new block structure. So it's kind of hybrid with these big boxes meshed into the grid. Third strategy, regreening. And so again, this is the potential for some de-densification. So we know vacant properties can be converted into gardens and parks that can help stabilize the values of the properties surrounding them. And regreening is also an opportunity to restore the local regional ecology. So this is an example in the Phelan neighborhood of St. Paul in Minnesota, where a wetland had been filled in to build this strip center. And you can see the image in the middle. They'd always had drainage and flooding problems in the parking lot because it wanted to be a wetland. So the property was torn up and the wetland was reestablished, reconstructed, and new housing then was built around it. So it's serving this stormwater and ecological function. It's also in a bird migration corridor. That's what this diagram shows. The origins of this project came out of design research done at the university in the landscape architecture department. So you have the reconstructed wetland that's doing an ecological function, but also is an amenity for the new housing around it. And this is in a relatively distressed neighborhood in St. Paul. And I was there a year ago, and there was a hawk hunting ground. So the migrating birds are definitely using the lake. This is an example that kind of brings all three strategies together. This is the Northgate Mall in Seattle. This is a historic mall. It was designed by John Graham, the first mall that he innovated the now classic dumbbell mall type, where you have anchor stores at each end and a food court in the middle, and a relatively narrow concourse with the inline stores all along it. So it's a thriving mall. It's still full, and they've added new additions to it. It's Simon Properties, but they have too much surface parking lot. So these overflow lots at the south, which were rarely used, and the land actually slopes down because it was the headwaters of Thornton Creek that drains 680 acres of runoff of surrounding area that had been put into a 5 or 6 foot diameter culvert pipe underneath 60 years ago. So environmentalists wanted to daylight this and make it all into a park. There was a negotiated solution. So landscape architects working with the city designed this surface water quality channel, which is also an amenity park. And so this is senior housing and townhouses and a cinema that was built around it and looking into this water quality channel, which is actually the headwaters for the creek. And then the quadrant of parking next to it will get redeveloped as well. For now, it's the terminus of buses to downtown. So it's a kind of park and ride facility, and they'll build a streetcar when they extend the light rail. It'll terminate here. And there are other examples of auto-oriented. This was a parking lot. This was a gas station. This was the Sears Auto Store. It was evolved and incrementally retrofitted as this neighborhood becomes less auto-oriented, more transit-oriented. And it's also a NORC, so it's a nationally occurring retirement community. A lot of the neighbors moved into their houses in the 1960s and 1970s. They still live there. There's a hospital nearby, there's a community college where they can take classes, and they can go to the mall, and they can walk around the mall rather than drive to it. So now I want to quickly talk about these 11 tactics that support the 3 strategies derived from the case study research. So first is reuse the box. I'll just go through super quickly. This is the example I already showed you from Belmar, and all of the reinhabitation examples can fit in this category. Providing environmental repair. This is just a zoom in of the Thornton Creek water quality channel that I mentioned earlier. And one of there's a kind of public education piece of this. So these are little markers of the water quality. And there's signage and other ways to explain to people the ecological function of this park. Revised zoning and then public works standards. One example is the ITE manual for design and walkable urban thoroughfares. I'm working on a project right now at City College with a colleague in the civil engineering department for a manual on accommodating freight vehicles in complete streets projects. So there's more that's being understood about how to thread these things together in a sensitive way. And then, of course, thinking about zoning. Another tactic, walkable blocks, and getting the dimensions right. So the rule of thumb is a perimeter not to exceed 1,800 feet. Blocks larger than that, without SAOs or walkways through them, are really not going to be walkable. And also trying to get up to that threshold of 8 dwelling units per acre to support transit is a piece of this as well. And this is an example of how not to do it. I should have a big X over the one on the left. So this is the appearance of urbanism in the suburbs, but it's overscaled. It's like a Frankenstein version of the Texas donut with fingers. And so you end up with a completely non-walkable block. It's completely auto-oriented versus the more properly scaled example on the right. So we to be beware of some, this really should be 4 blocks on the example on the left. Use shallow liner building. This is back to Belmar, but the parking structure there, the ground floor that faces across the street, only residential use, townhouses, is subsidized artist studios. So just 20 foot deep, so the depth of a standard parking space, 18, 20 foot deep, is enlivened with these artists who are there during the day, at night, and on weekends. So that's not a dead blank facade. Real streets and sidewalks, and this again is where urban design and a sensitivity to design that comes in, because you see retrofits where they're trying to do a street, but it's overly wide and the buildings on each side are too low to get in extra angled parking or whatever it is. So one example we can point to is Santana Row. Streetworks designed this for Federal Realty Trust. It's the same team that did Assembly Row and Bethesda Row, but it really is nicely proportioned of the width of that central street to the height of the building framing. Connectivity. So this example is unbuilt, but it's a proposed retrofit of a garden apartment complex outside Indianapolis that's organized around a golf course that just had one gated point of entry. So that guarantees an auto-oriented experience. And the proposed retrofit increased the points of connection from 1 to 11 by just opening up potentially at all these points where the neighboring streets are located. Future connectivity and adaptability. So often there's resistance to adding increased density at the outset, but that doesn't foreclose the possibility in the future. So a sensitive urban design will still leave open the options for making connections in the future. So at Belmar, this strip of land was not part of the retrofit, but the streets still line up rather than enclosing on themselves, so that if that property gets retrofitted in the future, those connections could be made. Or at Mashpee Commons, similarly, this complex was worried about through traffic and other kinds of things, and they couldn't just close that off and put in a few more houses. But instead, if you leave the stub out, so that sometime in the future, if the conditions change, those connections could be made. Or in this example, where it's still relatively low density, you've got the Walmart. This is along the Denver light rail, but laying out those parking lots and where the aisles are to be future streets, and locating the utilities along those corridors, not just laying them out diagonally at the shortest distance between 2 points, can reduce the cost later at retrofitting because you've already got the utilities laid out for that. Diversity in housing choice and price. This is the big one. This is about having more choices in the suburbs. You're not making people leave their houses that they love and they own. It's about choices for your children, for your parents, for your neighbors and friends. This is one example. It's not a beautiful building, but this is in a retrofit in Hyattsville, Maryland, Georgia County. 4 bedrooms, 4 bath units. So this is marketed to college students. University of Maryland is nearby. That idea that these 1 to 2 person households, or even 4 person households with sharing, if the unit types are made available and developed. And then there's the missing middle set of housing types that can be very good for embedding or integrating into an existing neighborhood. And here's an example of Rhode Island. This is a 15-unit building or complex, and you could build it as a double-loaded corridor, 3-story apartment building that would be out of scale and out of character along the street with the neighboring houses. Or the same density, the same 15 units, arranged as a cottage court, and along the street, the 2 front houses just look like more single-family houses, and then you pull into the courtyard, the parking is all consolidated over here, and this is the built image. So you can get that density, just design it and configure it out differently. Adding housing units to existing neighborhoods. So this is one way to do this is to allow accessory dwelling units, attached or detached. This has become very popular in the Pacific Northwest. So many municipalities have allowed accessory dwelling units or detached accessory dwelling units, and they don't all happen at once. They happen very gradually and slowly over time, if you can get the initial acceptance. What they did is, here was a design competition. So this is one of 3 examples that were sponsored through a design competition to help lessen the objections to making this a zone change. It's really very attractive at that point. Which brings us to investing in quality architecture. I should have emphasized this more with the developers this morning. It's a huge problem on Long Island is they're starting to build mixed-use sensor on the sidewalk projects around Long Island, but they're all so ugly. And part of it is because the design quality of the facade is very thin, so it's final windows without any depth or reveal or shadows. And when you're up close to a building designed that way, it's not that pleasant. It's one thing if it's behind, back 50 or 100 feet from the road, or you're driving past it, but when you're walking past it, quality matters. Anyway, that's just a side rant. One of the ways I've done this is get involved with competitions of various kinds to try and get more speculative ideas, but also built ideas in circulation. It's like enlarging the gene pool of design ideas for suburban communities. And the two I've been very involved with the Build a Better Burb on Long Island. So that began as a design competition that I helped organize with the Rash Foundation, building on a RPA study that they've commissioned to document all the vacant land and surface parking lots within a half-mile radius of every Long Island Railroad train station and Main Street on Long Island, so 156 locations. And we opened it up as an international design competition. What would you do with this vacant land? And that has all been documented on this website that's now the Rash Foundation handed it over to the Congress for New Urbanism to run. But they're collecting lots of case studies and examples and very acceptable stories here organized along with 5 themes. So it's not like a CNU members only forum. It's meant to be something more broad and accessible, not insider talk, I would say. So some of my work is published here, including this article on these 11 tactics that I just talked about. A second project I did with them 3 years ago, I guess, or 3 years ago, was Parking Plus. And this was a more targeted, invited design challenge where we paired 4 design teams with 4 municipalities. So we had buy-in from the mayors and elected officials. This was looking at municipally owned surface parking, either owned by the municipality or owned by the Long Island Railroad, next to these train stations in these 4 communities. And the premise was surface parking lots take up a lot of land. You consolidate it in a 4-story parking structure, no loss of parking spaces. So there was conservation of parking spaces, but then you would free up 3/4 of the land for other uses. And what other uses would you put there? So we had 4 very provocative schemes that came out of this. I'll just show you the one for Rockville Center that was designed by UTL, I think, here in Boston. They did a really great job. And here, the Long Island Railroad is elevated, and they targeted 3 out of 11 municipal parking lots to do kind of prototype parking structures that would have flat plates, the idea being they could possibly be re-inhabited for other uses in the future when private automobile use maybe is reduced. And the first story was double height with these arches, the idea being that during the week, commuters would park there, but on the weekends and the evenings, that space could be repurposed as a covered public plaza for markets and other kinds of events, so to really make it a civic space. And these are some of the images. So those are the 3 prototype parking structures that kind of plugged in to the elevated Long Island Railroad. And it was also an idea that this could link into some regional set of park structures. And this was just an image showing the potential reinhabitation of one of those parking structures as housing, and then a rendering of what the first story with the higher ceiling might look like on a weekend as a public market. And then just to wrap up, last slide, the new book that Ellen and I are working on, more case study examples, but we really want to raise the bar. So rather than organizing the material by pre-retrofitting development type, so the first book was here are all the retrofits of shopping malls, here are all the retrofits of office parks, of edge cities, and so on. This one is being organized thematically. So case studies that redesign stormwater systems, too much water, too little water, and renewable energy, reducing auto dependency, improving public health, retrofitting for an aging society, ramping up affordability, capitalizing on social capital networks, creating and competing for jobs and learning from international examples. So these are the themes that we're really trying to advance in our current research. Okay. So, if we have time for some questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that a lot of communities are sort of change, and you know, whether or not the community wants it or not, you still have to factor in the market like there, like this. And I guess I'm just curious, for you sort of all your ideas really interesting, but like how do you sort of get the community or developers to sign on to something like this? And there are obviously great examples, but I think still there's a tendency to just like go right now. You know, I'm working now at a SIC mall, and now they're just kind of making it a decent mall, like slightly more out of the mall. That's there's a number of them around here, but you know, could have had this great housing and all these things, and they just kind of blew it off. So I guess I'm.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. So we can point to hundreds of examples that have been successful. So there's hope there, but there are many, many more places that aren't changing, even if there's the opportunity for it to change. So that's disheartening sometimes when you see a retail-to-retail conversion that is perhaps even more auto-oriented than the one before, when it's turned into a big box power center or something. There's always an opportunity when those kinds of decisions are being made. That's partly why we write these books and we try and publicize these examples to create an opportunity to at least consider other alternatives. I guess this is a little bit of the backhanded bright side, but even if they repurpose it, in 20 years from now, they're going to have to revisit it again. These are not lasting development paradigms. So that the pace. This is a half-century-long project. Probably it's not all going to happen immediately. So the examples that are successful have champions working on them, from both the public and private side. They are often very distressed, or if they're thriving, there's a recognition of changed circumstances. So an opportunity to put in structured parking, free up some land, add some other uses. So one of the underlying messages, though, with retrofitting is that every retrofit is different and specific and local. So it's not substituting one new formula for an old formula. It's hard work. Yeah.
Thank you. In your work, have you noticed any relationship between retrofits and the build?
Yes. Short answer is yes. And I think that's one of the key pieces that's a driver, a facilitator of change. And of course, that's also an opportunity to redress concerns about parking or traffic that might be generated by the project. So the presence of transit allows a study to be done to demonstrate that those impacts can be mitigated. I think the real estate community understands that there's a market for transit-oriented development that has walkable characteristics to it for a certain market segment. So it's often a more high-end thing. So then that brings up questions about being more inclusionary and making sure that transit-oriented developments don't price out folks who could really benefit from the transit advantages. I think one of the things that's a real potential, and maybe something a group like yours could look at too, is different kinds of transit. So autonomous transit. I think we need to talk more about that, and not just about autonomous vehicles that leave unchallenged the assumption that it's still going to be a kind of one occupant, one vehicle paradigm, and that we're just going to replace our private cars with autonomous cars. Autonomous transit has incredible potential to reduce the headways and smaller vehicles that could move around more flexibly. And somebody needs to be championing that narrative, I think, because the narrative about autonomous vehicles is being driven by the private companies who see the certain path as where they make most money. And can we give that whole discussion or debate away? So that's it. Thank you.
Most of it's fascinating with why the background concept, because it's essentially replacing the greenway in the center, one side, and the auto access on the other side. I don't see that much in your examples, except for some of the examples. But particularly in the residential component, we see that sort of model.
I think that's something, yeah.
But it's just that instead of connecting streets, that we're connecting houses and greenways to reconnect.
Yeah, I think I've concentrated here more on retrofits of commercial properties. The truth is that retrofitting a residential subdivision with private ownership of the houses is incredibly difficult and complicated. So to introduce a Radburn model is more likely to happen in a new subdivision or a new residential kind of development, and I think we do see those in a lot of the new urbanist communities play around with that in various ways, interesting ways. I think there's a bit of a competing goals or desires, because if you want to increase connectivity in the overall street network, then the Radburn cul-de-sac model is not going to work so well. And of course, what we know happened is that as the Radburn model became adopted, the greenways around which the housing was organized were cut. So you just ended up with the back-to-back houses rather than having fronting onto the large communal green space. But I do think this regreening piece of it, the adding of civic spaces, if they're in these mixed-use retrofits with the housing plugged in, I think it's a huge benefit and something for which there's a lot of opportunity.
In Charlotte, where I just came from, they had two older malls. They retrofitted them. One of them became very much a mixed-use site that they daylighted the greenway. Very successful. The other one is still language, city owns it, not development. And it seems to me like that part of it is really the market force of what was the next hip neighborhood, and that got a champion film. It's not even on the train line, no, it's actually going to be on the train line. It's just getting a little bit too far out. Should we be looking at maybe concentrating on those ones that maybe are a little bit easier to work with? And I mean, it's kind of sad that they bought it, you know, the city bought this one. Just sad.
Yeah.
And acres of dead land in an area that would have used more affordable housing. Just can't get going.
Well, that's where perhaps some of the reinhabitation and anticipatory retrofitting tactics can come into play. So they might have a more short-term plan that would bring in some other uses there that might have to be subsidized in some way, but rather than letting the whole thing lay fallow, might start to spur potential future interest, and maybe some things that they can do in terms of preparing the site without being overly specific about the exact mix of uses and character that they imagine coming there. I think this issue, one of the things that I'm very interested in is trying to help expand the categories of uses that could go into retrofits, because I think it's a little too pat to do the work, live, play. Work is white-collar office, live is a kind of market rate, multi-unit housing, and play is retail. You know, what else could there be? And I think there's lots of different ways to perhaps think about more productive work uses. Light industry that can be incorporated, it's not polluting. Other kinds of workspaces that you can enliven the ground floor, perhaps with schools, community college classrooms, worker spaces, maker spaces, all kinds of things. It doesn't have to be leased retail. There's not enough of that to go around. There's too much of that already. It's just moving it, shoveling it from one location to another. maybe in the box.
Yes, thank you very much for coming here, Amara. I want to make a comment and ask you a question. I'm going to make my comments on our zoning reform legislation. I'm Vegas here, and I know whatever I say is taken back to you. So, you know, a lot of these sites here, and also elsewhere in the country, they're big sites, they have multiple owners, they have numerous zone sections, they're zoned in some cases differently. And a community with the most progressive intents can attempt to rezone that entire area. This is where, in order to do the kinds of things that you're talking about, and this is where that obscure issue of vesting that might not be is so important in zoning reform legislation. Right now, the way things work in Massachusetts is you have one owner out of 60 that's not like the way you're going to rezone. They basically put a subdivision plan on the map, they file it, and they say to the community, you're stuck, too bad. You got to buy us out somehow, or your whole plan. And that's one of the critical reasons why we need zoning reform, so we can actually give the community some kind of authority to do these things, to well thought out plans that won't hold it. The question to you is about green space. I'm so happy to see that you included that as one of your major, I don't remember the tactics of strategy.
It's both.
Okay. It is sometimes difficult, especially if the site being considered is smaller, to encourage a municipality to say there should be a green element to it. It does not usually generate its own tax revenue. So we all know we can make the whole thing more pleasant, more marketable, better quality.
You get a premium for it.
And I'm wondering how folks go about, how you and others go about trying to educate and convince the community that the green elements to these projects are really critical and important.
Again, we work through case studies and examples, so it's showing the images. I think the cottages on green is an example from Rhode Island of the 15 units around the shared green space. That's one example where it's social. I think there are examples where it can be shown that that green space is doing ecological work, so handling stormwater in various ways. And so you can make that kind of argument as well, so it's a performance-based argument and not just shunting that into some drainage pond that's way in the back, but really integrating it into the whole design scheme. I think it's finding 2 or 3 positive arguments that all synergistically work together and support the inclusion of open space. I would say many developers want to do that anyway because it adds a premium and an attractiveness to the project. And but I think it can be finding the 2 or 3 arguments. And I think that the stormwater argument, management argument, is a big one and a potentially very productive way to argue for it. Okay. Yeah.
So in terms of the vacant commercial space, it's not just shifting consumer preference, it's also the suburbanization of poverty and kind of the geographical movement as well. So, and this is kind of implicit in your presentation, but how do design changes help kind of the lack of social support that kind of exists in suburbs at the moment, since they haven't traditionally had field projects?
That's a big question. I think we're still looking for good examples of that and a more robust attention to both the challenges and the opportunities. We often point to examples of more community-serving uses being located in these retrofits through the reinhabitation, and I think there's opportunities for the social service organizations to establish satellite locations, maybe different agencies all co-locating in a strip mall where folks are coming there anyway, so it fits into their daily pattern. A lot of the parking lots of strip malls and malls have become bus stations, right? So people are coming through there to get their regional buses. They might not even be going to the mall, but that's where they catch their bus to go from one place to some other place. So I think finding people on their route, so you're not finding them at their home necessarily, but on the places they're habitually passing through. And retail spaces are, of course, workspaces. There are play spaces for the shoppers, but there are workspaces for the pink collar working, or however you want to phrase it. And so capturing people there on their way to and from work, I think is potentially part of this as well. I think there's ways that daycare can get inserted into these locations. The community college classrooms are a way for people to get job training. I'm interested in seeing more culinary training type uses, or maybe centers that are in strip malls where people can prepare foods to sell that are in, certified commercial kitchens. So this way, we thought about the sharing economy, the co-working spaces has mostly been associated with millennials and people with education, right? But that co-working idea can, I think, spread throughout the socioeconomic spectrum, and some of these vacant commercial suburban spaces could be very conducive to that. But we need more ideas. I don't have the answer. More people thinking about it. Great.
You mentioned the diversity in housing, and I noticed a lot in my community and others that we're getting a lot of 1 and 2 bedrooms, and then a lot of developers will say the 3+ are not economically feasible for them. That's mostly Massachusetts. How have places elsewhere done that? And just tag on, have you seen any place that has done universal design for ages in place for their housing? So the lack of threshold places either when you're 18 or 80.
Yeah, I think, so the first question, I know the DC market, the New York market, the Bay Area market, I think there's a number of companies that are jumping on co-living, I think they're calling it, not co-housing, co-living. And it's already happening, right, informally. The loft apartments where people have 3, 4, 5 roommates, only 2 of them are on the lease, right? So a number of these buildings are being put forward where you pay a rent that includes the Wi-Fi, that includes the use of all the shared community spaces, and you get matched to a room within a suite. So there's that model, I think. Extending that to older adults, I think, will be really interesting as well. I think the market is there, but we need some more leaders, I think, to take the plunge in designing for it. So adapting an existing building is one thing. New construction is another.
Usually adapting and they're putting rooms in to make sure that they're not putting just a little box that people can fit over.
Oh, well, that's the second question, right? Yeah. No, I think, that's a little more the fine grain. The urban design, we tend not to look at that, but certainly in multi-unit housing, it shouldn't be that difficult to make it universal design. I think a big challenge coming along the pike, and a lot of people have talked about, using phrases like the silver tsunami or whatever, that a lot of people approaching retirement age and already in those decades live in suburbs currently. That's where they live, and they're not all moving to Florida. So how are we going to retrofit the whole community so they can age in community? And I think this is a really challenging thing. So it's adapting their houses, but maybe also allowing them to rent out part of their house, so it makes it easier to stay there economically long term, or providing avenues for them to just move in the community to a group living situation nearby. So I think there's a whole set of things in the toolbox that need to be creatively considered. And I think the suburban municipalities here in Boston, as fractured and irascible as they might be, this is something that I think they would understand is eventually going to cost them a lot of money in terms of the services that they're going to need to provide if they don't get out in front of it. Yeah, there's a chapter on that. Yeah.
2 questions. One, obviously, we don't control who develops what land. So the first question is related to how do you provide incentives, or what are the best incentives that you have seen that have worked to get the development where a community wants to see it in these areas that you want to see retrofitted and reused, as opposed to the greenfields. So that's question one. Question two relates to, you mentioned affordable subsidized rents for artists as part of one of the developments. We are seeing a lot of cases where communities are putting in mixed-use redevelopments in areas, and they can rent out the units, the residential units, really easily, but they keep trying to rent the retail units for market rate, and they are vacant, which does not really provide for a good active street. So I'm very curious about examples that you might be able to provide where there have been subsidies for commercial rents. It also goes to the displacement issue, especially in urban areas where you're pushing out the mom and pop stores that are able to survive in the old one-story buildings, and when the new building gets built, they could move back in, but they can't afford the rents.
So that's really is about the developer sensitivity, I think. We ran across examples of developers who understood that the value of their market rate leases was at least partially contingent on differentiating the property and making it not as generic. And so the subsidies are partly a result of that. One of the ways they do it is providing some pads or lease spaces that are quite small, 20 by 20 feet, too small for the chain retailers. And those are easier to subsidize. They're small, so there's less risk there.
You don't see programs where it's built into the zoning. For instance, where we have 10% affordable residential required.
I think one should be very cautious about overly prescribing use mix in zoning. I think that can really rebound and end up undermining.
I'm not talking about uses, I'm just talking about subsidies. I don't care who's in there, just trying to keep the price low.
That you could work into the deal, sure. And it could be some, maybe it doesn't have to be retail, it could be just any locally owned business. But there's lots of architecture offices could be subsidized and would make a great streetscape, because we work all hours of the day.
So what about the first question in relation to incentives to developers? You know, is it the zoning? Is it the streetscape improvements? What have you found to be the key thing that starts it off?
Well, I think a part of that is that municipalities have to, in their economic development plans, not try to be playing both sides at once. You've got to make a choice and put your chips down. If you want redevelopment, retrofitting at a higher density, you have to disincentivize or preserve the open space that you have. That's part of it. And that maybe start to regionalize that kind of agreement. Because, of course, the developers will say, if you don't give me what I want, I'll go to the next municipality that has an equivalent open space for me to develop. So that's part of it, is trying to get the municipalities to work regionally to undercut the propensity to set them off one another in competition for the greenfield development. I think municipalities should understand, too, and maybe it just needs to be pointed out over and over and over again, that the tax benefit per acre of a higher density redevelopment compared to, so you don't just look at the revenue per project, but look at it on a per acre basis, and the higher density retrofit is going to win every time, I think, in that kind of. And the land is the limited resource, right? Yeah, sorry. I'm just.
So I just wanted to thank Professor Williamson so much for spending really the whole day with us.
Yeah.
First at the Developers Roundtable, and now in this meeting with staff and some of our leaders and municipal officials as well. I do want to thank Juan Vega from the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development for joining us. Thank you. Juan is also a member of our board. And to recognize Michelle Sicolo and Lou Gito, who are also members of our executive committee.
for being present for this conversation. This is an increasingly important issue at MAPC as we expand our practice of working with suburban communities on retrofitting spaces that are not satisfying their objectives and are not actually satisfying the regional objectives either. But it's a struggle. I feel we're right at the beginning of it. It's not easy, as you've indicated, and it's great to have another friend who's done such innovative work on this issue. So thank you. I wanted to also thank Karina and Chris for organizing this effort and for stewarding the Developers Roundtable, which meets 3 or 4 times a year, and which took place, I believe, in this room this morning. So thanks to them as well. Thanks to all of you.
All right. Like that, two proposals this morning, 2 different developers, 2 developers that are underperforming in the suburbs of my community this morning. And so that's a bit of a tough balance. Well, no, we have some really great and exciting things, but what it comes down to is traffic and parking.